100 tons of seeds? Not soldiers, not bullets, seeds. From the belly of low-flying helicopters, crates burst open and rained across the cracked earth of the Sahel. To some it looked absurd, a stunt born of desperation. To others, it was madness, an expensive gamble in a land already bleeding from drought. And yet, in that moment, something far greater was being sown. For decades, Burkina Faso had been trapped in the same cycle. Rain that never came, soil that eroded, imports that chained the nation to someone else's harvest. Aid arrived in sacks, stamped with foreign flags, never enough to feed the body, never enough to nourish the soul. This time a different hand moved. Ibrahim Traoré, young, unyielding, chose not to beg for bread. He chose to scatter sovereignty from the skies. But here lies the question. Can seeds dropped from the heavens grow roots strong enough to change the destiny of a nation? Or will the wind, the drought, and the vested powers of the world sweep them away before they take hold? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. The story begins not in a palace, not in a parliament, but in the dust of the savannah. Villagers looked up as the sky thundered. They expected uniforms, rifles, perhaps another routine drill of the army. But instead of soldiers, it was boxes. Instead of bullets, it was seeds. 100 tons. Not a trickle, not a token gesture. A deluge of maize kernels, peanut shells, cassava roots, millet grains, each bursting from wooden crates as helicopters skimmed the horizon. Their blades whipped the red earth into spirals, as if the very sky conspired to turn soil into womb, dust into promise. Planting in Burkina Faso had always been intimate. Bent backs, calloused hands, neat rows carved into dry ground. What appeared on that day was the opposite of tradition, chaotic scatter across plains that stretched further than the eye could see. Farmers who first stumbled upon their fields rubbed their eyes. The land, once cracked like broken clay, was freckled with seeds, as though the savannah itself had sprouted freckles of hope. Behind this theater of the air lay months of preparation. This was not random seed, not a careless mix. Within the blend were quick germinating millet strains that could burst through dust in days, offering forage for hungry cattle and gazelles. There was cassava, deep-rooted, able to reach water hidden beneath the soil and to stand strong when the sky withheld its mercy. There was maize, hybrid and resilient, engineered not by foreign laboratories but chosen by African agronomists who knew the rhythm of the Sahel. Each cluster of seeds mapped to zones. Wet lowlands, dry ridges, transitional belts, so that no variety would strangle another, but rather weave together into a patchwork of survival. The audacity was not in the science alone, but in the politics. This was not foreign aid, not a donation stamped with another flag. No charity trucks parked at borders, no photo opportunities for visiting dignitaries. The operation had been planned in secret, resourced by domestic coffers, supplied by regional partners, guarded by local pilots. Yet audacity comes with a price. The helicopters themselves had to be hired at staggering cost. Fuel, logistics, trained crews, all in a treasury already stretched thin by defense spending and fragile infrastructure. Ministers grumbled in private. Some saw recklessness, others feared humiliation. Critics whispered, what if the birds devour the seeds before they sprout? What if the rains refuse to fall? Foreign partners bristled as well. Development agencies, long used to steering Burkina Faso's food policy, were suddenly excluded. Grain exporters in Europe and North America, whose profits thrived on African dependency, saw danger in this experiment. A self-sufficient Burkina Faso was not just an economic shift, it was a crack in the foundation of their control. And so the gamble was laid bare. This was more than agriculture. This was sovereignty scattered from the sky. Each falling seed was a challenge hurled at the old order. That Africa must import survival, that aid must be begged for, that hunger was destiny. Inside the presidential palace, maps spread across the war room table told the deeper story. Soil quality charts overlaid with rainfall predictions, animal migration routes traced alongside human settlements. It was not a gamble of blind faith, but of careful calculation. Still, even calculation cannot command the clouds. For days after the drop, the land remained silent. The sun burned hotter, the dust carried farther, and each dawn seemed to mock the boldness of the act. In Ouagadougou, opposition voices sharpened. In Paris and London, newspapers ran their ridicule. Traoré's folly. On radio call-ins, market gossip grew louder. Expired seeds, black market deals, poisoned soil. And yet, beyond the noise, in the villages where hunger gnawed most fiercely, there was no choice but to hope. Farmers watched the horizon with eyes that had memorized disappointment. Children played in fields speckled with dormant kernels. Herders led their cattle further and further in search of green that no longer grew. Then came the night of waiting, the 12th night after the great seed drop. The air thickened. Clouds rolled in from the northeast, heavy, swollen, defiant against the drought. And for hours rain fell. Not a torrent that destroys, but a steady soaking drizzle that carried with it the scent of renewal. From the Malian border to the lowlands of the southwest, water kissed the seeds where they lay hidden. But here the story hangs, for rain alone is not enough. Will these scattered seeds root deeply, rise defiantly, and rewrite the fate of a nation? Or will skeptics be proven right, their mockery vindicated by fields of failure? The answer lies not in the sky, but in the soil. The first green threads are about to emerge, but so too are the first shadows of sabotage. The rain had barely touched the soil when the world began to speak, not with celebration. In the cafes of Ouagadougou, whispers traveled faster than the drizzle. Call-in radios buzzed with doubt. The seeds are expired. They are genetically modified poison for the soil. The president bought them cheap from the black market. Opposition figures seized their chance. They painted the aerial drop as theater, a desperate trick to score political points while the treasury bled. Foreign newspapers were merciless. In Paris, a headline sneered, "Traoré's folly, an expensive spectacle for the cameras." In London, commentary framed the operation as reckless environmental roulette. Washington think tanks cautioned about ecological risks of uncontrolled seed dispersal. Yet beneath the polished language lay a quieter fear. What if it succeeded? What if one of the poorest landlocked nations proved that dependency was not destiny? Grain lobbies in Europe and North America wasted no time. Their press releases dripped with feigned concern, worries about invasive species, about destabilizing regional markets. But the real destabilization they feared was to their own profit margins, their monopolies built on the hunger of others. Inside Burkina Faso, the cabinet itself was divided. Some ministers questioned the wisdom of spending millions on an untested experiment while defense costs mounted and infrastructure crumbled. Yet in the rural provinces where hunger was not a debate, but a daily fact, the reaction was different. Farmers looked to the heavens. Herders scanned the horizon. For them, hope was fragile but necessary, a gamble worth taking because no alternative remained. Then the 12th night, the sky heavy with tension broke open. Rain fell not in violent floods but in long, patient sheets. Soil drank deeply, and by dawn the savannah carried the scent of life returning. The first days revealed almost nothing. To the untrained eye, the earth still looked barren, cracked, brown. Satellite photos circulated by foreign media gleefully declared failure. Yet down at the level of bare feet and calloused hands, something subtle was stirring. Green threads, thin as needles, fragile as whispers, began pushing through the earth. By the second week, those whispers became a chorus. In the semi-arid Sahel belt, millet sprouted in wide carpets, pale shoots trembling in the breeze. Gazelles returned, followed by wandering cattle who had not grazed in years. In the lowland floodplains, cassava broke the surface, its roots already pulling unseen water. To the west, maize stalks reached upward, their leaves unfurling like banners of defiance against the drought. This was no accident. The seeds had been matched to microclimates with precision, humidity, soil chemistry, even wind patterns studied in advance. Agronomists from the National Agricultural Research Institute worked quietly in the background, avoiding the spotlight of foreign agencies, logging germination rates that exceeded laboratory projections, sometimes over 80% despite the meager rainfall. Their encrypted reports landed on the president's desk, one line repeated in each. The strategy holds. Yet hope once visible invited attack. In the eastern province of Gourma, disaster struck. A storage depot housing surplus seed stock for a second planting was engulfed in flames. Villagers swore they saw men with foreign accents fleeing toward the border. An investigation traced the sabotage to mercenaries tied to a multinational agribusiness recently excluded from Burkina Faso's contracts. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer just about crops. It was about power. Back in the capital, the palace war room shifted tone. Maps, once marked with rainfall predictions, now carried annotations of infiltration routes. Grain had become a battlefield. What was meant to be an agricultural operation was turning into a struggle for sovereignty itself. Traoré remained unflinching. To his advisors, he declared, "If the rains come, we will feed ourselves. If they do not, the roots will hold our soil and our hope until they do. Either way, we have stopped begging for bread at someone else's table." But if hope had taken root in the soil, its enemies were already sharpening their tools. What began with ridicule was mutating into sabotage. Fires, rumors, pressures from abroad. The gamble was no longer just a question of germination. It was a contest of will between a nation daring to plant its future and powers determined to uproot it before it bore fruit. And in the smoke of the burned depot, one truth became clear. Burkina Faso had sown not just seeds, but enemies. The quiet war for food sovereignty had begun. The fire in Gorma was not an isolated ember. It was a signal flare in a much larger war. What began as skepticism had now hardened into sabotage. Within weeks of the depot blaze, another blow surfaced. A shipment of seed destined for the second drop in Mali arrived contaminated. Bags that should have carried the next season's hope were laced with chemicals designed to sterilize the soil itself. It was not clumsy vandalism. This was sophisticated sabotage, requiring access to compounds unavailable in West Africa. Forensic testing traced the toxins back to a European supplier deeply entangled with international grain cartels. In the palace, reports grew darker. Intercepted communications revealed foreign operatives moving under the guise of aid consultants, agricultural experts, and development officers. Their laptops carried wire transfers, contracts, and encrypted instructions. Their mission was not to help, but to hinder, not to cultivate, but to poison. President Traoré responded with precision. He authorized Operation Iron Canopy, a covert sweep across the agricultural belt. Intelligence officers disguised as farmers and traders infiltrated NGO compounds. Within 3 weeks, 14 consultants had been quietly escorted to the borders, their devices confiscated. Analysts combed through hard drives, uncovering financial trails that led straight to lobbying groups in Brussels and Washington, the same groups that had been calling for sanctions since the seed drop was. The revelations confirmed what many already suspected. The battle was no longer between man and drought, but between sovereignty and dependency. Grain was not just food. It was leveraged currency, control. To break free was to threaten an empire of trade routes and profit margins. Yet even as foreign pressure mounted, the green shoots spread. Across the Sahel belt, millet matured fast enough to feed herds that had been starving. Cassava anchored the soil, reducing erosion that had plagued farmers for decades. Maize fields shimmered like waves of gold beneath the unforgiving sun. For the first time in years, villages that had survived on handouts now looked at their own fields and saw abundance. The effect was psychological as much as material. Hunger had always whispered defeat into the ear of the peasant farmer. Now the land itself whispered back resilience. Children played in fields where cattle once found only dust. Women gathered cassava leaves, not in desperation, but with pride. Rural radio stations replaced foreign aid announcements with weather reports and harvest forecasts. But prosperity, however fragile, sharpened the knives of opposition. Inside the capital, political rivals spread fresh rumors that the crops were genetically engineered, that they would poison the next generation, that the government had mortgaged the land to foreign creditors. Social media amplified fear, each rumor repeated until it sounded like truth. Still, Traoré stood firm. At a closed meeting with his generals and agronomists, he delivered a line that would echo across the countryside. "We will not defend crops as if they are fragile. We will defend them as we defend the flag." And so the silent war escalated. Special forces began escorting seed convoys. Grain silos were guarded like armories. Irrigation channels were rerouted through underground pipes, plans originally meant for the future, now activated in urgency. In this crucible, something larger began to stir. The farmers of Burkina Faso no longer saw themselves as passive recipients of aid. They saw themselves as guardians of a national project. Neighbors in Niger, Mali, and Ghana took notice. Delegations arrived quietly, some seeking cooperation, others seeking intelligence to replicate the model. A domestic gamble was turning into a continental spark, for if seeds could be scattered by helicopter, and rise against the odds. Why not in Niger's plains, Mali's valleys, Ghana's forest fringes? If Burkina Faso could stand against cartels, lobbies, and ridicule, why not the rest of the continent? It was then that commentators first spoke the phrase aloud, African Revolution. Not a revolution of guns and barricades, but of roots and shoots. Not fought in trenches, but in furrows. Not measured in toppled regimes, but in harvest sacks. A revolution in which sovereignty was not negotiated in embassies, but grown from the soil. Yet revolutions invite resistance. Intelligence intercepts suggested that hostile powers were already discussing regime change scenarios. Traoré's name appeared on lists circulated in shadowy boardrooms. Grain, it seemed, was dangerous enough to kill for. The president's security tightened. Convoys multiplied, decoys deployed. Yet he refused to vanish into bunkers. In an unannounced visit to the town of Dori, he walked among millet fields and told farmers, "No one owns the sky here except our people." The message was clear. Surveillance drones, foreign operatives, and hostile lobbies might hover above, but sovereignty was rooted below. But as the shoots grew taller, so too did the threats. The next battle would not be fought with whispers or sabotage. It would strike at the very moment of proof, the harvest itself. Beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, the seed drops sent ripples through the corridors of power. Inside the African Union, debate split the chamber. Some delegates hailed the experiment as a model for continental resilience, proof that Africa could mobilize its own knowledge rather than wait for shipments stamped with foreign flags. Others, cautious and bound by old alliances, muttered about reckless precedent and regional instability. They feared not the seeds, but the idea that a small landlocked nation could redefine the rules of dependence. ECOWAS was equally torn. In Bamako, voices in Mali whispered admiration, seeing in Traoré's defiance a mirror of their own struggles. In Accra, Ghana's officials dispatched observers, quietly exploring whether aerial seeding might bolster their own food security. But in Abuja, Nigeria's policymakers worried that the bold act could ignite pressure from their own citizens. If Burkina Faso could dare so much with so little, what excuse remained for richer states still tethered to imports? The West reacted with a different tone. In Brussels, lobbyists for European grain interests pressed harder, warning that Burkina Faso's unsanctioned intervention might destabilize agricultural markets. In Washington, cautious language emerged from think tanks, concerns over unverified ecological risks, potential disruptions in trade flows, and governance issues. None spoke openly of profit, but behind closed doors the fear was simple. If one seed drop succeeded, many others might follow. At the United Nations, a closed-door meeting of the Food Security Council convened under the guise of addressing Sahel drought. Yet the questions directed at Burkina Faso's envoy were thinly veiled accusations. Was aerial seeding legal under environmental conventions? Did the government consult international experts? The subtext was clear. Independence undertaken without permission was, to some, a greater crime than famine itself. But the most telling responses came from Africa's streets, not its summits. Across Bamako, Niamey, Lome, and beyond, ordinary citizens watched footage of millet sprouting in once barren fields. For them, the spectacle was not folly, but proof that the future need not be rationed in sacks of aid. And so a question echoed from village to village, from parliament to parliament. If Burkina Faso can grow sovereignty from the soil, what does that mean for us? For international observers, the issue was no longer simply crops or rain. It was about precedent. It was about the possibility that Burkina Faso had set in motion a chain reaction, one that might redraw the politics of trade, aid, and autonomy across the continent. And so the world leaned forward, watching, calculating, fearing, or hoping, because this was not only about today's harvest, it was about the future of Burkina Faso, and perhaps by extension the future of Africa itself. As the fields ripened under the Sahel sun, one truth loomed. The harvest would not just measure food, it would measure freedom. The season of truth approached. Fields once barren now shimmered in waves of green and gold. Millet, heads heavy with grain, bowed in the Sahel breeze. Cassava leaves spread wide, their roots anchoring both soil and spirit. Maize stalks rose like sentinels guarding a harvest no one thought possible. But abundance does not defend itself. As crops ripened, new threats emerged, subtle and violent. Truck drivers were whispered threats. Move this harvest and you risk your life. Middlemen, funded from abroad, offered inflated prices to lure farmers into smuggling grain across borders. Intelligence reported a plan to poison irrigation channels. Another scheme sought to bomb highways to paralyze the movement of harvest convoys. President Traoré answered with a single phrase, "We will not defend crops like they are fragile. We will defend them as we defend the flag." Thus began Operation Harvest Shield. Before dawn, armored convoys rolled across the savannah, escorting trucks piled high with grain sacks. Special forces blended into villages unmarked and unannounced. Their presence felt more than seen. Irrigation channels were rerouted through hidden pipes, contingency plans activated long before anyone imagined they would be needed. In markets, undercover agents posed as buyers, exposing and arresting those attempting to bleed the harvest away. What might have collapsed under sabotage instead hardened into resilience. The countryside itself became a fortress. In village after village, ordinary men and women stood guard over their fields, not with rifles but with presence. Human walls surrounded ripening crops, a living testimony that this was more than food. It was dignity, it was sovereignty, it was the proof of a people refusing to bow. The first convoys reached storage hubs under cover of a dust storm, as if the land itself sheltered its bounty. Foreign media, expecting images of failure, instead received pictures of overflowing granaries and smiling farmers. Analysts grudgingly called it a logistical feat under hostile conditions. But in the villages, it was spoken of more simply, the year the land fought back. Yet the road ahead was not without peril. Independence gained in the fields would provoke sanctions might tighten, markets might shift, pressure might mount. But with every sack of maize and every root of cassava, the balance of power tilted. Because sovereignty is not declared once, it is defended daily. And Burkina Faso had proven it could defend. The harvest was secured. But the question remained, was this the end of a gamble, or only the beginning of a longer struggle to remake the continent's destiny? The gamble had ended not in silence, but in song. The helicopters that once scattered seeds into cracked earth now echoed in memory as the first act of defiance. Fields that had been graveyards of dust now swayed with gold and green, and in villages once haunted by hunger, laughter returned to the fireside. Yet the true harvest was never only grain. It was dignity. It was proof that a nation need not live on handouts stamped with foreign flags. It was the knowledge that sovereignty could be planted, nurtured, defended, and reaped. What Ibrahim Traoré dared was more than agriculture. It was the planting of an idea that Africa's future would not be written in aid agreements, but in furrows of its own making. That sovereignty was not a gift to be granted, but a seed to be sown. From Burkina Faso's fields rose not just millet and maize, but the early shoots of an African revolution. That revolution was not of barricades and gunfire, but of harvests and hope. A revolution that insisted trade must replace charity, that partnership must eclipse pity, that Africa's soil could feed Africa's children. Each sack stored in Burkina Faso's silos was not only food, it was a manifesto. And so the world now asks, what comes next? Is this victory a fragile exception, or the opening chapter of something larger? Will sanctions and sabotage strangle the dream, or will neighbors take up the call and scatter their own sovereignty upon the wind? The answer lies not only in policy or diplomacy, but in the resolve of people who have tasted self-reliance and will not forget its flavor. For the future of Burkina Faso is no longer measured by imports or aid convoys. It is measured in fields defended like flags, in farmers who see themselves not as victims but as authors of their own survival. And in that measure, Burkina Faso has already changed the map. This is not charity. This is sovereignty. This is the seed of an African revolution, and its harvest has only begun. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map.